Well, we're in the midst of a series. It's titled, It's Time for Christmas, and that's hard to believe, but it's time for Christmas. It may not feel like Christmas outside to you all, but this actually fits very well with the type of temperatures we would typically be experiencing. In fact, from Orlando, that would be cold for us, what we've been experiencing the last couple of days. Susan and I were kind of reminiscing about that. I imagine if it was the temperature as it is, even in the mid-60s, you'd see people in Orlando walking around with sweaters and so forth. So just know that some of us, it does feel like Christmas, but I would love to have the cold weather. I love the cold weather. I'm ready for that. So we're going to begin this morning by jumping into Luke's Gospel. And many of us are familiar with the Christmas story as it is laid out for us in the Gospel of Luke. Specifically, we're going to look at one text. That's going to be our main focus today. Maybe there's some other stuff that we're going to kind of sprinkle in. But our main text this morning is going to be found in Luke chapter 2, verse number 7. I'm going to invite you, if you would be kind enough, to read it with me this morning. And let's read it together. Luke chapter 2, verse 7. Let's begin. And she brought forth her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. This is a picture for us that quite honestly is unmistakable in so many ways. And many of us have been raised around the manger scene at Christmas time. And we have this picture in our minds, many of us, even if we don't have the manger scene with us, we can have this picture in our mind of what it is supposed to look like. We picture Joseph and we picture Mary, and usually what do? They're gazing at baby Jesus. If you look at most of the nativities that are out there, we have one in the sanctuary that's up on a table right up front. We have one here that's off to the side. In any of them that I've ever been around, we always see Mary and Joseph, and they're always gazing and focusing on Jesus. And that's a good thing, because that's what we're too called to do. We're called to focus on Jesus. And we certainly see that in this quiet, simple setting. Jesus is usually asleep, and he's sleeping in what would be a bed of clean straw. There's no filthy hay that's here or straw that's available. Jesus is there, he's asleep. Sometimes when we look at Jesus, there's even some light that's emanating from around his head. Kind of like a halo or a glow, because after all, he is the Son of God. And so we have that picture in our minds. We also recognize that the overhead stars are twinkling, because of course it is a clear night, is it not? It has to be. Jesus is born. And sometimes there's even a full moon for some of us. In fact, one of my favorite experiences of the drive through Bethlehem here at the church was right around, I think it was the first or second year, we had a full moon. And by full moon, I'm talking about a massive full moon. And it was just above the horizon. And it was powerful. As I was walking out to my location, I looked over where the manger was, and we had the smoke billowing. And off in the distance was this full moon. And then to hear some of the people drive through that went through a couple of times, and they came through the first time and said, "Can we go back through again?" I said, "Absolutely." They went back through. They came through the second time, and I said, "Let me ask, why did you go through again?" And they said, "We wanted to see if we had the same experience." And I said, "What is that?" They said, "The first time we were going, we looked off just to our right, and we saw this shadow of shepherds with their long staffs walking towards the manger." And they said it was almost surreal. It's this picture that we get this time of year when we think about the manger scene. You know, we always have cattle. We have cattle, and we also have sheep resting contentedly. And you know there is not a nativity scene, at least in my picture, without a donkey. It's a faithful donkey. I mean, the donkey deserves to be there after putting all that work and traveling all that distance to bring Mary and Joseph to this place. And usually when you look at the donkey, this donkey almost has a grin on its face, knowing its accomplishment as it gazes over towards where the Christ child is. Shepherd and wise men, for many of us, it's a picture of our Christmas scene as well. And so we have this beautiful scene before us. We love this quiet scene. Amen? Isn't that wonderful? Doesn't it feel like Christmas when we talk about that? Let me burst our bubble here this morning and let you know that the reality is that quiet scene, well, it wasn't likely reality. The fact is that the peaceful scene would bear little connection to what really happened that night in Bethlehem. It would not have been peaceful. There would have been people coming in from all over. Why? Because of the census that was being taken. There was travelers. With travelers, there's always chaos. Amen? I know around our house when we're getting ready for a trip, we have a tendency to have our nerves are on ends, right? We're kind of on edge. Am I the only one that experiences that? You know, and so we're trying to get things together. And so those people have traveled, and certainly not everything goes the way you plan it whenever you travel. And so that leads to additional tension. And, you know, the traffic on the donkey trails was probably rather extensive that day. And so they're dealing and struggling with all of that. And so by the time they get there to Bethlehem, it's not this peaceful scene that we have a tendency to equate to this special evening. It definitely wasn't as clean as we have a tendency to think about, and there's no reason to believe that the shepherds and the wise men ever saw Jesus at the same time. But there's a problem, at least for some of us, or maybe I'm just alone in this, but since I'm up here talking, I'm going to share what problem I see in this, is that we have the Son of God who comes down from heaven. Let me say that again. The Son of God comes down from heaven, and where he's placed? He's placed in a stable, a manger. We hear this so often, we kind of just take it for granted. But if we're honest with ourselves, we sit here and say, wait a minute. Here's the Son of God who's just come down from heaven, and he's placed where? In a manger? It just doesn't seem right, does it? Am I the only one that thinks that way? I know I'm strange and peculiar, but I would dare say that if we took time to think about it, it just doesn't make sense to us. But why? Well, because he's the Son of God. The Son of God does not belong here. The Son of God does not belong in a manger. The Son of God does not belong in a place that is dirty and likely has animal stuff lying around. I don't care how much you shovel, it's still there. He's come from heaven. He doesn't deserve to be treated like a commoner. In fact, if we're honest, we'd say that he deserves the very best the world has to offer. And let's be honest, even the very best that the world offers isn't good enough, is it? So this manger thing seems kind of out of whack. I mean, how does he come from heaven to earth and end up in a stable? How can that possibly be? And if we're honest with ourselves, what we really want to ask is this: God, what were you thinking? Right? Because we know that God could have done better. At least that's our perception. God, you could have done better. I mean, from my perspective, if I had all the power that God has, then I had an opportunity to choose the time, the place, and the manner in which my child, my son, was going to be born. Do you really think that I choose to have him outside in a stable? I don't think so. It just doesn't make sense to me. So why is it happening? And why is there no room in the inn? Perhaps it'd be good for us to kind of backtrack a little bit. We talked about Bethlehem a couple of weeks ago, and you may remember that Bethlehem was really this quiet little hamlet, if you would, a small town. It was nothing more than a place to pass through on your way to Jerusalem. They're only about 6 miles apart. You may remember that. In fact, Bethlehem would have been inhabited by only about 200 people. Most of them would have been shepherds. Some of them may have been farmers, and others would have been merchants, just to make sure things were operating as they should. But that would have been about it. What made this small village well-known, I guess would be the term, is that King David was born there. That was his hometown. Those familiar with the Christmas story perhaps remember that there was this guy by the name of Caesar Augustus. Perhaps you remember him. We have him portrayed as a part of our drive through Bethlehem. And Caesar Augustus from Rome declares that there's going to be a census. Now, the reason the census takes place is what we understand. We get this, there's going to be a tax. And we know how the government likes to tax us, amen? And so the government decides that they want to have a tax, and so they decide they're going to have a census. And as a part of the census, it means that the men have to go back to their ancestral home. And so therefore, since Joseph is of the line of David, his ancestor is King David, and David was born in Bethlehem. That means he has to go back to Bethlehem. We also know a part of the story is, as Joseph is going back to Bethlehem, is that Mary is very, very, very pregnant. They arrive at Bethlehem. But I think what we need to understand is this was not an accident. You see, I believe as I go through this story, as I understand who God is, I believe that God arranged everything. I believe that God arranged so that the emperor would declare this census to be taken at just the right moment, in just the right time, so that Mary and Joseph would arrive in Bethlehem at the appropriate time, the designated time, so that they would be able to fulfill what the prophet Micah had said, that the Son of God, this baby, was going to be born, the Savior of the world, the Messiah, was going to be born there in Bethlehem as it had been foretold. So what seems to be chance to the world around us, the reality is it wasn't a chance at all. In fact, it was God moving through history to accomplish His purpose. In fact, I think it's so important, I think it probably needs to be a point that we drive home and we kind of get ingrained in our brains, as I have a tendency to say. And it's this: if God ordains it, then He will make a way. Do you believe that? If God ordains it, He's going to make a way. Oh, okay, God, we understand that you ordained it. What's this end thing? I mean, why were they turned away from the inn? It says no room for them. Part of the problem is we have a tendency to think of this as the fact that they were turned away from the Bethlehem Holiday Inn, right? Or the Hilton, or the Springfield, or whatever it is that we may be thinking of. The Hershey Hotel. How's that one? Or the Hershey Lodge. We have some people here today that work at the Hershey Lodge. I better incorporate that one in there as well. Well, we tend to think of a nice building just off the freeway. It's easy access on and off so that we can get where we want to be. It's usually 3 to 4 stories tall. And of course, when we go to these places of lodging, we don't really call them inns anymore. We call them more like hotels, or if we're really exclusive, we call it a resort. But we want someplace that has a nice parking lot, has a large lobby. Certainly it needs to have a pool and a hot tub. And let me say, cable television and Wi-Fi is critical. And if we're really into a high-end place, we want to make sure that it's not just breakfast that we get free in the morning, but it needs to be a hot breakfast. Amen? Because that's what we look for. And we consider roughing it when the ice machine breaks down, okay? Because that's a struggle for all of us. Because I will tell you, my wife, when she doesn't have ice with her soda, it's like dealing with a pregnant woman, okay? I'm just saying. Yeah. Ice is critical in our house. She loves her ice. In fact, when she gets iced tea, she always has an extra glass of ice brought to her, okay? She understands it says iced tea for a reason, okay? She gets it. And when we're without ice, that's roughing it. If we can clear our heads of all those notions that this, is the Bethlehem Holiday Inn, it would serve us well. Because in all of the Roman Empire, there was no such thing as a Holiday Inn. There wasn't even a Red Roof Inn where they promised to keep the light on for you. In those days, travel was dirty, and travel was difficult, and travel was dangerous. In fact, travelers, one thing they were looking for was security. They wanted to be kept safe while they tried to recoup, while they tried to catch rest from the day's travel. And so the inn was simply a building where you could find rest and safety in the middle of the night. Indoor plumbing wasn't an option. Cable television and Wi-Fi, that's another 20 centuries down the road. I mean, they are roughing it to the highest end. But in order to properly understand what happens, we also need to recognize that in Luke's gospel, not just in this text, but in Luke's gospel, we actually find there's 2 words that are used to describe the word that we use of inn, I-N-N. The first one that he would use is referring to a small building that's dedicated to serving travelers. And it's similar in some ways to what we would have today. It was a place that was multiple rooms, and the traveler would come, and for their fee, they would lay on a really rough mattress on the concrete floor, or the dirt floor, whichever the case may be, and their animals would be tied off at the end of the building, and for their money, for the fee that they pay, they would not only be provided a place to sleep, but they would also be provided security, and their animals would be fed. That's the type of inn that when Jesus talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's what he's talking about. The other word, inn, is the one we find here in Luke chapter 2, verse 7. It's the word that basically means a guest room. It's as if Jesus was to show up at your house and ask if he could stay at your guest room. Now, it was not uncommon in those days, especially when a lot of travelers were coming into the area, that people would open up their homes and they would allow people to use the guest room. And oftentimes, they would pack those guest rooms filled with a lot of other people. Okay, so it would not have been a place that would have been, for me, very comfortable. I like my space. I like my privacy. The animals would not have necessarily been tied to the back of the building, but would have been placed in a stable, which is really nothing more than a cave with low walls or low rocks around it to try to corral the animals for the night. That's what they're facing. And the Bible tells us that they were turned away. There was no room for them in the inn. Now, why was that? Well, we've always assumed perhaps that It was that the inn was full. No room in the inn, no vacancy. That makes sense to us. You know, we picture even maybe this no vacancy flashing light, but again, electricity is down the road. And so the innkeeper would have likely had to keep going to the door. That's why he's probably agitated when he says, there's no room in the inn. Can't you people get a clue, kind of thing. He looks at Mary and Joseph, though, and realizes another possibility as to why they were turned away is that they were poor. So maybe it wasn't the fact that it was full, but Mary and Joseph couldn't pay the fee. They're poor. But he also saw that Mary was very, 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 very pregnant. And probably thinking about his other customers. Because let me just ask it this way. If you knew that you were sharing a guest room with a lot of people that you didn't know, and you see this woman walking in that is very pregnant, how many of you are thrilled about your circumstances in that moment? None of us. And so perhaps the innkeeper is thinking, you know what, the last thing I want to subject these guests to is this woman who perhaps could deliver this baby at any moment. So there's no room for her in this place. The only thing we know is there was no room for them in the inn. Everything else is conjecture, but it brings us back to our major point. And from a human point of view, we see this, that nothing in this picture looks right. It just doesn't. I mean, yes, it makes a wonderful setting this time of year when we can focus on the manger scene. But in the grand scheme of things, if we were there in that moment, would it have made sense to us? I mean, Jesus deserves better, and God could have done better from our standpoint. And so why does it happen like this? Why does God allow it? And I'm not even sure that that's the right question to ask. Why does God allow it? I mean, think about it. If we believe in the sovereignty of God, and in the sovereignty of God we mean this, that God is above all things and He is in all things, that God is in control of all things. That makes Him God. And so if we believe in the sovereignty of God, then we must believe that God did not simply allow His Son to be born, but we must believe that God ordained it. We must believe that God ordained for His Son to be born in a stable. There's no room in the inn. It happened because God ordained it. He wanted it that way. If God wanted something else to happen, it would have happened another way. So here we have Mary and Joseph. Joseph compelled by the census to go to Bethlehem in the latter stages of Mary's pregnancy. This journey would have been difficult at best. In fact, highly religious Jews likely would have traveled from Nazareth, and they would have gone east across the Jordan River. Then they would have gone down to Perea and crossed into Judah at Jericho. They would have ascended, keep in mind, ascended through the mountains to Jerusalem. Can you imagine what that must have been like on the back of a donkey, ascending these mountainous roads? With a pregnant woman, you're trying to carry all this stuff? How difficult that must have been. And then they made this 7 or 8 mile journey south to Bethlehem. And so this jagged journey, which would have taken them east and then south and then west and then south again, would have allowed them to avoid Samaria altogether. In other words, translation, they could have taken a shortcut. But they chose not to because they're devout Jews, and they avoided Samaria because we all know, if you know anything about Scripture, the Samaritans and the Jewish people didn't get along. And so they go out of their way to make sure that they avoid that land. This 90-mile journey, let me say that again. 90-mile journey, pregnant on the back of this donkey, would have taken them a minimum of 6 or 7 days. Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem, turned away at the inn. The baby's born in a stable. Where's the stable? Outdoors. Animals are nearby. No privacy, no sanitation. Very little protection from the elements. Again, doesn't make sense. But God ordained it that way. In preaching on this subject, I love what Charles Spurgeon, he's a great evangelist and preacher, I love what he says about this. He said the best commanders, as to why this would happen, he said the best commanders are those who have the common touch, who are not afraid to mingle with the soldiers on the front lines, who aren't ashamed to get their hands dirty in the trenches of warfare, When soldiers know that their commander has walked where they walk, they will follow him to the ends of the earth. And so in coming this way, understand what's happening. Jesus Christ is making it very clear that everyone, even the poor of the earth, he was making it very, very clear to them that in Jesus Christ, they have a friend who cares about them. I think another way to put it would be this, is even the humble feel invited to come to Jesus Christ. He's turned away from the inn. He's born in a stable. That's incredible. It's an invitation to those who have been turned away. What an incredible picture. Here's the Son of God being turned away. And it's a symbol, really. It's a picture for those of us who have been rejected, those who have been turned away, those who have been abused, those who have been forgotten, those who have been overlooked. It's an invitation for all of them to come to Christ, the Son of God, for salvation. I mean, if Jesus had been born in royalty, let's be honest, many of us, if we had a say in it, that's likely what would have happened. If Jesus had been born in royalty, we might be afraid to approach the throne. But let me ask you a question. Is there fear in approaching the manger? There's not, is there? There is no fear in approaching a manger. If Jesus had been born into royalty, only the rich and famous would have felt comfortable coming to him. But since he was born in a stable, all the outsiders of the world, let me say that again, all the outsiders of the world would instinctively feel a connection with him. By being laid in a manger, he proves to us his willingness to endure the very things that we endure. He invites all of us. It doesn't matter what we've done. In fact, it's interesting what the religious leaders of the day said. Perhaps you remember what's said in Luke chapter 15, verse 2. They're complaining, the religious leaders are complaining once again about Jesus. It seemed like their pastime. And they said of him, he was associating, meaning Jesus. Jesus was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. Shame on Jesus for eating with sinners, right? Jesus responds to these arrogant religious leaders saying this in verse 10. He says, there is joy in the presence of God's angels when even one sinner repents. And so being laid in a manger rather than being born into royalty really displays why Jesus Christ came. Jesus Christ came to make himself available to everyone. It doesn't matter what your status is. It doesn't matter what the society says you are. He came as a friend to sinners so that the sinners might be led to repentance, so that the sinners might be able to experience the life God desires for them to live. And so this being born in a manger, this being rejected, turned away from an inn, turns out to be much more than an incidental detail that we love to tell as a part of our Christmas story. The reality is, it is central to who Jesus Christ is. Jesus Christ had to be born like this. It could not have happened any other way. That's why God ordained it that way. It's also interesting to me that being born into a stable also provides, at least for me, a hint of his eventual death. Jesus is turned away from the inn and resting in a feeding trough. And in doing so, Jesus was already bearing the only cross that a baby could possibly bear. Extreme poverty and contempt and the indifference of society. Think about that. The Son of God experiencing extreme poverty, contempt, and indifference of society. But God has come to the world. Let me say it again. God has come to the world. Isn't that good news? That's what it is. God has come to the world. And he came in a most unlikely way. That's why Paul says this when he writes in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7. It said, he, Jesus, gave up his divine privileges, and he took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being when he appeared in human form. Nothing about this baby Jesus appeared to be supernatural. I doubt it was very likely that there was this halo around Jesus' head, that somehow there was light emanating from his skull. I doubt that there were any choirs singing there at the manger. Yes, there were some for the shepherds, but remember they told the shepherds to go and see what was taking place. If you were there in the midst of that story, in that moment, and you came upon this couple who had just given birth to this baby, and you find this baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger, if you had no other information, you would have concluded that this was just a baby born to a young couple who was down on their luck, who was poor. Nothing about the outward appearance or circumstances pointed to God. Let's be honest. A manger, a stable, none of that points to God, at least from our perspective. And yet all of it, every single part of it, every single solitary, seemingly random detail was planned by God the Father. He has ordained it to happen before the foundation of the world. And for those who don't have a clue, they see nothing. But for those of us who understand on this side of history, we realize that God's fingerprints are all over this. Now you may sit here and say, well, Kevin, that's really a cool story. But really, what does it have to do with me? I mean, we're supposed to talk about the manger at Christmas time. I get that. But what does it mean to us? Well, there's some things that we learn here. Actually, 4 things that I believe we learn here. At least I did, and I'm going to share them with you here this morning. The first thing that we learn is this, is that God uses adverse circumstances. God uses adverse circumstances that, to be honest, that make no sense in the moment, and He uses those adverse circumstances in order to accomplish His future purpose. Do you believe that? God uses adverse circumstances in order to accomplish His future purpose. At first glance, this idea that there was no room in the inn seems like an insignificant detail. I can't say that enough when it comes to the larger picture. But I can assure you that to Mary and Joseph that night, it was no small detail. They traveled 90 miles, treacherous. You've got a woman who's about to give birth. You know that they're tired, they're worn out. They've been fighting travelers all day. They come to this place and they're told that there's no room in the inn. Being turned away in that moment, they're told that if they wanted to find rest, they could find rest there in this manger area. And Mary ends up giving birth to the Son of God in a stable. And giving birth in a stable no doubt would have tested the limit of their faith. Would not make sense to Mary and Joseph. I mean, they've been told that she's carrying the Son of God. In their mind, do you really think there was ever a moment prior to this that they're thinking to themselves, boy, it's going to be so awesome when we can lay our baby in straw? No. In their mind, as moms and dads have a tendency to do, they're thinking this through and they're making preparations, and it is going to be miraculous and glorious and wonderful. In no way do Mary and Joseph think that they're going to be giving birth to this baby with animals around them. It's just not meant to be that way. And there's no way that they could have foreseen how this negative, and it would have been perceived by us as humans, this negative turn of events would ever turn about to be a part of God's plan. And life is often like that. There's moments in our lives when we deal with struggles, when we deal with circumstances, when we deal with things, when we deal with life, and they don't make sense to us. I hear people say, well, you know, someday it's going to make sense. Well, let me just say this. Some days may never come. There's going to be things that happen in our lives that may never make sense. I hear people say, well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask Jesus this. No, you won't. You're going to be so busy worshiping God that you're not going to give a rip what happened down here. And so some of it may never make sense to us. As I was reviewing my notes this week, I was reminded once again, as we've been praying for Mia Grace, this young 2.5-year-old girl who's got aggressive brain cancer. Yes, they got the tumor. They think they got it all. But they're also going to have to put her under aggressive chemotherapy. As I thought about that, I was thinking about her parents. Do you really think that when that child was born that it was ever part of their plan for Mia Grace to have a brain tumor? To have to undergo chemotherapy? No one could say what their long-range prognosis might be. But I imagine for her parents, none of this, nothing about this makes sense. And what I found in those moments when nothing makes sense, that the best that we can do, rather than trying to explain the mysterious ways of God or trying to answer the unanswerable question, the best thing that we can do is to rest on what we know about God. And what do we know about God? We know that God is good. We know that God is just. and we know that God is merciful. It's important for us to remember that His ways are not our ways, and His understandings are not our understandings. But it's also important for us to remember that He's not like us, in that God does not make any mistakes. So whatever we're dealing with in life, God does not make mistakes. Now that's a hard one for us to grab a hold of, because in our minds we're thinking, God, there's got to be a better way. Well, it doesn't get any better than God's way. And that's what Mary and Joseph are dealing with. So I take great comfort in the fact that God knows what He's doing. And He uses everything that happens in my life to accomplish His purpose. In me, through me, and for me. And nothing is wasted. When I make a decision to make Christ Lord of my life, nothing that He does in my life, that He allows in my life, is wasted. Absolutely nothing. And nothing here is wasted. Not even being turned away, because there's no room in the end. The second thing that we learn in this lesson here today is that the world had no room for Christ then, and the world has no room for Christ now. John chapter 1 verse 11 says this: He, meaning Jesus, came to His own people, and even they rejected Him. Translation would be that He came to the people who should know Him best. He came to people who should not have been surprised by all of this. I mean, they may have been surprised in the manner in which it took place, as baby being born in Bethlehem, or in a stable, I should say. They should not have been shocked that it was in Bethlehem. Why should they not have been shocked? Because it was foretold by the prophet Micah. They knew exactly where Jesus, the Messiah, was to be born. How do we know that? Well, do you remember when the wise men come and talk about asking where Jesus is? And what do the religious leaders say? Well, He was born in Bethlehem. They're not shocked by this. They understand. They know what's been foretold. They have ample warning. I mean, even some of these pagan astrologers we call wise men from Persia figured it out when they saw a star in the east. But things aren't much different today. The reality is, if Mary and Joseph came to Hershey, they'd likely not be allowed admittance into the Hershey Lodge or the Hershey Hotel or the Springfield Suites down the road. The reality is, we may not even let them in our own home because we don't know them. What we do know about them is they've been traveling for a distance, they're poor, and they don't fit in. And so how do we respond to that? The world oftentimes has no room for Him then or now. But there's a third thing that we learn about Jesus, and it's this: it's that Jesus' humiliation started early and continued to the very end. He was born outside. We're going to talk about this in a moment. But He was born outside because they wouldn't let Mary and Joseph come inside. During His ministry, listen to what Jesus says of Himself in Matthew chapter 8, verse 20. He says, "Foxes have dens to live in. Birds have nests." In other words, animals have homes. But the Son of Man, meaning Himself, Jesus Christ, the Son of Man has no place even to lay His head. Jesus Christ owned nothing. Nothing. He had nothing except the clothes on His back. He had to get food from other people. You may remember that when He was crucified, the only thing that He did own was His clothing. And remember, the soldiers gambled for His robe. When He died, they buried Jesus in a borrowed tomb. He couldn't even afford a grave. Our Savior's birth, in so many ways, pictures the whole course of His life. And then we read this together. We're going to read it together in a second. Let me get a swallow of water here. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 12. Let's read this together. "So also Jesus suffered and died outside the city gates to make His people holy by means of His own blood." He was born outside the inn. He died outside the walls of Jerusalem. Jesus, understand, was an outsider in every sense. Jesus came from outside the earth. He was born outside the inn, and He died outside the city walls. An outsider. That's why all of us are able to come to Him. The final thing that we learn is that as followers, that would be those of us who have made a commitment to make Jesus Christ Lord of our lives, His followers share his fate. I'm 51 years of age, and to some of you that's young, to others it's just about right, and to a few of you, I'm an old dude, okay? I've heard or read the Christmas story from Luke chapter 2, verse 7 for 51 years. But it wasn't until recently, in fact it was this week, where I finally realized what was being said here. You see, I've always read or heard this story from Luke's perspective in this phrase. I've always read it this way, because there was no room for him in the end. That's not what Luke said. Luke again, Luke 2:7 says, because there was no room for them in the end. It's important for us to be reminded that the innkeeper had no idea that the Messiah was about to be born. But I always read it that there was no room for Jesus. And that's true enough. But I want us to notice there was no room for Mary and Joseph either. And that's true of every detail in this story. In fact, every detail in this story tells a story. Because they're also outside the inn when Jesus is born. And so what happened to him happened to them. And that too is a pattern for our future. You see, many years later, Jesus, as a part of his ministry, was talking. And it's written for us in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 34. And this is what Jesus said. Jesus said, if any of you want to be my follower, if any of you want to follow me, then you must turn from your selfish ways, you must take up your cross, and you must follow me. When Christ calls us, he calls us to come, and he calls us to die with him. Wow. We come to the end of the story of Luke chapter 2, verse 7. And while it's filled with some very simple words, what we find is that even the tiniest of details have enormous significance. I said this in the first service, I'm going to say it again. We're called to be followers of Christ. But as a follower of Christ, it doesn't mean that we're going to have an easy life. Many of you pay attention to the news around us. You realize that, well, I hope you realize that while we may not be persecuted for our faith right now, it's a coming. I believe that with all my heart. I will also say this, the greatest threat in this world and to this world is not ISIS. It's not even global warming, in case you wondered.
Say it ain't so.
The greatest threat in this world right now is us Christians who fail to be the followers of Christ and he's called us to be.
Amen.
And we haven't been willing to die, to take up his cross and truly follow him. We look at the examples around us. More importantly, we need to look at the example in the mirror that looks at us each day. Are we being what God has called us to be? See, that's the greatest threat in this world. I believe with all my heart, if we as Christians would actually take a stand upon the Word of God, we could actually make an impact in the culture in which we live.
Amen.
But we choose not to. Instead, we strive to blend in. Because we don't want to be outsiders. We don't want to be. The Bible tells us not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind in Christ Jesus. Too often, we've tried to conform because we don't want to be outsiders. And what we've lost sight is that's who Jesus Christ is. He came from outside this earth, was born outside of the inn, and died outside the walls of the city. He's calling us to be willing to be outsiders and to minister to those who in our culture are perceived as being outsiders, not because they're followers of Christ, but because, well, let's be honest, our culture has kind of pushed them aside. That no vacancy sign that was there, even though it wasn't flashing, the reality is it was still true. But it was there for our benefit. God could have made a room available if He would have liked, because He's God. God could have created a hospital, or He could have even created a palace in Bethlehem if He had desired. But the sequence of events that unfolded, the census, the long journey, the no room in the inn, the no crib for a bed, all of that, the swaddling clothes, it was all planned by God. It wasn't by chance. God willed that there would be no room in the inn, not for the sake of Jesus Christ, but for our sake, so that we would learn why He came. So He has come. The question is, will you make room for Him today? In your individual life. Charles Spurgeon, when he preached on this text, he made this appeal to his audience. He said, even as an infant, by being laid in a manger, He, meaning Jesus, was set forth as the sinner's friend. Come to Him, ye that are weary and heavy laden. Come to Him, ye that are broken in spirit, ye who are bowed down in soul. Come to Him, ye that despise yourselves and are despised of others. Come to Him, publican and harlot. Can you imagine the church saying that today? How about harlots coming in? Come to Him, thief and drunkard. In the manger there He lies, unguarded from your touch and unshielded from your gaze. Bow the knee and kiss the Son of God. Accept Him as your Savior, for He puts Himself into that manger so that you might approach Him. Have you approached Him? Have you approached Him to the point where you've given your life, that you are now viewed in this culture in which we live as an outsider? That's what He's called us to be.